give a perspective of Ayurveda, how Ayurveda looks at the process of drug discovery. I'll be sharing my views, my experiences with modeling, the Ayurvedic approach to development of drugs from botanicals. So if you look at the pharmacopoeia of Ayurveda, Ayurveda has used around 1,200 to 1,500 species of medicinal plants through the centuries. An evolutionary history spanning at least 3,000 years. And if you look at this, it just makes up a little over 10% of the total number of plants identified and used for medicinal purposes by tribals, folk communities, and other medical systems, including. It's a bit intriguing to find out that Ayurveda, a medical system that has been active for so many thousands of years, has used only so many few medicinal plants. So does this reveal a lack of proper exploration of the natural flora and biodiversity rich zone like India? Why was Ayurveda not so active? That's a question that I would like to pose before I get into my discussion. So this is the scenario, just about 14% of the totally known medicinal plants used by Ayurveda, whereas in the other streams we have 86%. So, and this is all the more kind of paradoxical because Ayurveda very clearly states that every substance in the world is potentially medicinal. And then it's so hard to believe that the tradition of Ayurveda would have stopped exploring the rich biodiversity and discover properties of newer plants. So, in fact, the Sushruta Samhita, I think Ayurveda was perhaps the first medical system to talk about what we call as bioprospecting, because the Sushruta Samhita says that the earth is bountiful everywhere, that we must search near riverbanks, mountains, lakes, forests, and even human habitats to discover new plants for medicine. So when Ayurveda had such an approach, this is paradoxical that we have used only few medicinal plants formally in the Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia. So with this background statement, I'd like to get into the whole process of drug discovery in Ayurveda. Now I think there's a very fundamental concept in Ayurveda is that only adequately known plants should be used. And I think this has been one of the main reasons why the total number of plants that got officially accepted in the Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia was actually much lesser than what could have been possible. The Charaka Samhita is categorical when it says that a drug source that is not adequately known is like poison, weapon, fire or lightning that can harm or kill the person. On the other hand, an adequately known medicine works like nectar. And there is this great awareness about, avijñātam aushadham. A medicine that is not well known, a drug source, should not actually be used in clinical practice. So now what I'm wanting to say is that this method of what Ayurveda calls as knowing a plant adequately is quite elaborate and structured. And I'd like to give an outline of what that means and why it has taken Ayurveda so many centuries to choose just those few medicinal plants with which it makes all its formulations. So we just did some preliminary analysis of the classical textbooks to find out how long that did take in those days to study a new plant or drug source and incorporate it into the pharmacopoeia. So if you look at only 1,000 plants were incorporated over 3,000 years, and it looks like this data is not really very accurate. It's just guesswork at this point of time, but there are indications that point out that it used to take 25 years to sometimes more than 100 years of observation and study before a new plant would get accepted into the pharmacopoeia. So, it's not the 13 years that we have. Of course, they were not technologically so advanced, but the fact is that they lay emphasis on the fact that unless we have information about the plant, adequate information, it couldn't get accepted into the pharmacopoeia. So what does it mean to study a plant or drug source adequately? And this is what I want to present, that there's a structured methodology, and we must look at it more carefully. I don't have a very elaborate outline at this point of time, but there are indicators and pointers which I think should be taken up as a very important activity in the future. So to understand a drug source thoroughly, a fourfold approach has been outlined in the classical texts: nomenclature, identification, properties, and applications broadly, but coming under many heads. I'll go through this in detail a bit later, but at the outset, I want to just point out that for a drug to be accepted in Ayurveda as a drug source, you need information under all these heads. And compiling this information used to take 25 to more than 100 years. So this is the criteria for acceptance of drug sources in Ayurveda. I'll come back to this slide a little later. Now, in Ayurveda, zoopharmacognosy seems to have been one of the methods. There's always this curiosity on how they really identified, what methodologies they used. And zoopharmacognosy seems to be one very important, approach, because the texts say that animals know the plants and that by observing them, we get the first clues. There was this intriguing finding sometimes back that city birds use cigarette butts to smoke out parasites. This is the zoopharmacognosy still in action. New substances produced by human activity, animals still, they don't have a laboratory, but sparrows in a university campus was found to pick up cigarette butts and use it to protect their eggs. And they found that these cigarette butts did have activity against the parasites that harm the eggs. So Ayurveda really considered this. The Ayurvedic parallel of an animal study, I think, was zoopharmacognosy. It was not, active testing on animals, but rather observation on how animals behave. And I was surprised to find that there are a lot of data now available. It's not been compiled. And I think that's another activity that could be linked with what Ayurveda already knows. Modern knowledge of zoopharmacognosy can bring out a lot of interesting facts about how Ayurveda made these drug discoveries. Now, before I go into a little more detail, I just want to contrast the modern and traditional approaches to drug development. There's a stark contrast, because one is based on isolation of molecules. We know that already, but just to refresh our thoughts, I'm just mentioning it again. And the other on interaction of molecules. Ayurveda is basically based on the concept of interaction of molecules. One is based on specific targets and the other on multiple targets. So drug development from traditional medicine, I think this is one of the things that today the approach is to start with a lead, which may be a plant or a simple or complex formulation, and then it's broken down to simpler ones. A plant is fractionated into molecules. Bulky powders are converted to more concentrated extracts. Active molecules and new chemical entities are identified, and specific molecular targets and diseases identified. We are quite familiar with this process. But in Ayurveda, drug development moves from simple to complex combinations. A single plant is combined with many other plants which are subjected to complex methods of processing before a drug is developed. And now here, I want to point out that today the research on botanicals seems to be revolving on this concept of converting traditional medicine to modern medicine. At the end of the whole research process, what we have is another version of traditional medicine. It loses its whole character, and we create it in the form of modern medicine. So my question is, can we instead use modern scientific knowledge to better understand traditional medicine and develop new applications inspired by both tradition and science? So I'll share my thoughts in this direction. And I'd like to point out that now let's look at what was the Ayurvedic process of drug discovery. There seems to be really two components or two phases. One is the study of individual drug sources. And this is the process of discovery of plants as potential sources of drugs. And this seems to be the most elaborate and time-consuming process in traditional medicine. And the other is the development of complex formulations and dosage forms from adequately understood individual drug sources. And Ayurvedic tradition has been very dynamic and proliferative in this process. And I'd just like to show this contrast. Over 3,000 years, we have 1,000 individual drug sources discovered, a new drug source in 25 to more than 100 years. Whereas if you look at the formulations that were developed from these individual drugs, they run into millions. So while they were very careful in choosing a new individual drug source, combining known drug sources into new formulations was much more a dynamic activity. So every day a new formulation would be made, whereas in 25 years to 100 years a new drug would be introduced. So this I would like to contrast and show that there is something, I mean, what Ayurveda really has to offer is the science of combinatorics. I mean, that is where the whole tradition has specialized. And so I'd like to point out traditional drug development as, combinatorics and cocktail approach to drug development. That the process of drug development in Ayurveda can be said to be a method of molecular combinatorics, and the finished products are complex cocktails of multiple molecules. Now, here is the key thing, and this is where we need to do work, that the traditional drug development knowledge that we have is like a jigsaw puzzle, because all this information is scattered across textbooks, and they are in a very codified form. I mean, information is not available in a very straightforward manner. And so, very often I think we give a lot of attention to the modern scientific methodologies, but not enough adequate attention to the fact that whether we have understood the traditional concept very clearly. Most often we work with pieces of the jigsaw puzzle rather than, taking the effort to first solve the jigsaw puzzle and then, work on the whole process of drug development. So now we come to the criteria for acceptance of drug source. We'll have a quick look through the various heads of information. There is no time to go into all the details, but I wanted to point out that in Ayurveda we had this tradition of updating the pharmacopoeia from time to time. The nomenclature were continuously updated. They were enumerated from an evolutionary point of view. The nomenclature was classified, and there were descriptive analysis of names. And when it comes to identification, Ayurveda very clearly differentiated between different properties of plant parts. In fact, some studies have shown that when the leaf and the root of the same plant are combined together, I'll just explain that a little later before I conclude, that there are different molecules in the leaf and the root. And when you combine the leaf and root of the same plant, you get an action which you cannot get with just the leaf or the root of the plant. And Ayurveda was very clear about these differences, that there are plants in which there is a homogeneous distribution of, chemistry of all the plant parts, some in which there is a concentration gradient, and in some others where they are very different. So this was one of the things, when you study a new plant, this is one thing that we need to know. And then the varieties. Ayurveda understood that there are very closely related varieties and there would be big variation. Variability was something which Ayurveda thought was so natural that you never expected, plants from different places to have the same property. And then the related species, ecotype, all these variations had to be studied. And in fact, some of the names of the plants refer to their ecotype variation. They are known by the places from which they are actually collected. And then comes this major thing about substitutes. For now it's understood that if a plant has been accepted into Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia, then you would find information on all these. That's what I wanted to kind of point out. And that is available in the text, but not, collated and brought about, in a systematic way, that right now if you ask for a particular plant and whether there is information, it's not readily accessible. But the methodology was such that all this information is available in the texts, and we need to find a way to bring them out, just like solving a jigsaw puzzle. Now, when it comes to properties, we do have physicochemical properties, but I'd like to point out that Ayurveda did not give that much emphasis to the understanding of a single plant. It was more concerned on how plants interact together. So much so that in some of the classical textbooks, the elaborate descriptions of properties of individual plants are almost missing. They're mostly talking about how combinations work. They're not even discussing about how an individual plant would work. So when you come to combinatorics, one important aspect is biotransformation. It's more important to understand how the plant would work once it is ingested into the body rather than what is there, when it is outside. And then the pharmacology in terms of the target, the risk-benefit analysis. It's very interesting to find that Ayurveda says that there is no safe substance. The Charak Samhita is emphatic when it says that everything has got good and bad effects. There's no safe medicine. And even small, simple substances like pepper, were considered to be toxic and needed to be processed or combined to make it more safe before use. Plants like Acorus calamus, Ayurveda very clearly recognized that it is toxic. There is an elaborate method of purification that is to be done. And in fact, Ayurveda has pointed out that even simple foods can produce toxic effects, if they are not used carefully. So this sensitivity to toxicity of substances is really very high in Ayurveda. And so we have to do a risk-benefit analysis. And this is the key thing. If you want to know how to use a new drug, it's more important to know not how it works individually, but how it works in combination with other substances. And this means other herbs, food, and so many other factors, like in a particular climate, how would a drug act? In a particular geographical region, would there be a variation? There are discussions on these kind of pharmacological activities. And when it comes to application, again, there are various heads in which this information is organized. Like all these plants are pharmacologically classified. They're kind of a chemotherapeutic classification based on the disease target, and then comes the formulation. After the formulation, the pharmaceutical processing, then the dosage form. Ayurveda has clearly pointed out that water extracts are different from fatty extracts, and it's not just for convenience. In specific stages of diseases, in one stage of a disease, a water extract is more suitable, and in another stage, a fatty extract is more usable. So there's a pharmacological basis for even the dosage form, and this has not been adequately kind of explored. And then the mode of administration. So I'm not going into details because of lack of time, but what I meant to point out is that if you were to collate the information from the text with inputs from the oral tradition carefully, for every plant, we would be able to construct a very detailed profile that covers all these headings. And that could be the basis, for the modern scientific research. Now, this is what is required, a comprehensive collation of the text with inputs from the oral traditions, or we end up with working with one or two pieces of a large and complex jigsaw puzzle. So, I mentioned this already, that every drug source has good and bad effects, and that Ayurveda says that a single drug is not safe, but it's through a formulation that we can make it safe. So safety is in the formulation and its actual clinical use, but nothing is inherently safe. And then we have, so now I'd like to say that when we organize Ayurvedic pharmacopoeia in the structured way, there are so many questions that come up for scientific inquiry, and this could be the starting point for the interaction between traditions. What are you doing? Are you aware of it? But a lot of this information is already there in the text. So that could be the starting point if you first map them and then, a bridge with modern scientific studies. The logic of using substitutes, the raw effects of drug source in the human body. This is a baseline. And then comes how you can modify it using the combinations. So if you look at the logic of combinations, we know today that if you combine turmeric and pepper, the bioavailability of curcumin is enhanced by 2,000 times. And this is why in India, in the diet, turmeric was always used along with pepper. And today we have replaced pepper with capsicum, and we have to see what implications that has. Now, there are so many such combinations. Like if you just study the text very carefully, it's not just single herbs that we come up with. We've come up with patterns of combinations. That why is ashwagandha to be always mixed with sadavari and milk? Why some herbs have to be used fresh and others dry? Ginger, nutgrass and aconite are always seen together. So there's some chemistry behind this combination. Now if you bring out these patterns from the text, then it becomes much more easier for us to subject them to scientific analysis. So now the last part of it, I'd like to point out that these kind of studies are beginning to come much more in Chinese medicine, and I think this is something which must also do in Ayurveda. Like in Chinese medicine, this is one example that they try to look at the chemical constituent variation between single herb and paired herb decoctions. And they found that in the paired decoctions, many chemical peaks increased in concentration, and many chemical peaks also decreased. So when you pair, the drugs, There's completely the chemical profile is being changed, and it's possible to study and demonstrate what happens when we combine. And Ayurveda already talks to us about, how we must combine. And everything is combination. I mean, there's nothing, no drug which is used singly. So we can, with knowledge of modern chemistry, maybe we can, without losing that complexity, still simplify it, because once we understand the molecular mechanisms, we might be able to make it much more. And then licorice and its fractions. It's very interesting, like licorice has been shown to affect absorption from the gut in an experiment where blood levels of glycyrrhizin were found to be lower due to reduced absorption when taken as part of an extract. But the same thing, when you give as a chemical, I mean, it shows a different action. A crude extract of licorice inhibits angiogenesis, but if you use glycyrrhizin and glyceritic acid, then it promotes angiogenesis. So, I mean, you have just a completely contrasting activity when we... Now, synergism of herbs, a combination of nettle, artica, ioica, these are all not again Ayurveda. They find that a combination actually inhibits 5 reductase and aromatase more significantly than the sum of either alone. So there's a lot of such studies already emerging, and I think in Ayurveda we would be able to do it more effectively if we can get the clues from the classical texts, if we organize the pharmacopoeia more efficiently. So there's again in eczema, they find when they use combination herbs, the actions are different. So this is the study which I was mentioning about, golden seal, where they found that when you combine leaf and root together, the chemical, 2 different chemicals interact and produce an effect that you will not get by using either the leaf or the root of the plant independently. So I'm coming to the end of my presentation by just pointing out that we have not been able to understand even the logic behind the simple formulation which Ayurveda uses so much in clinical practice, Triphala. And what I want to point out is not just using these 3, fruits, Triphala, but Triphala is further made into more complex preparations. And if you look at Triphala in various combinations, Triphala with honey in eye diseases, the kind of targeting is very astounding. Triphala in combination with few other herbs for headache, Triphala with gugulu in ulcer, Triphala as a honey wash in stomatitis, and Triphala with Vasa Katuki in liver disease. If you just look at the way even Triphala is subjected to further combinations, you see, I mean, so much of complexity in targeting. And so I'd like to come to the conclusion by saying that traditional systems of medicine like Ayurveda represent an early attempt in bioprospecting and development of drugs from natural resources. The current research on development of drugs from botanicals used in traditional medicine is conducted with inadequate understanding of the traditional knowledge, because it's not accessible and not organized in a way that would make sense to the modern researcher. So traditional medicine represents a method of drug development that is based on molecular combinatorics, and the final products being complex molecular cocktails. And the application of modern scientific methods can help us to better understand the rationale, but for this we need this baseline, and I think good effort has to be done in that direction. It's not mere compilation, it's organizing it just like solving a jigsaw puzzle, and then we have all the relevant information, and that would be the starting point for developing drugs in a more informed way. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was the purpose of creating a craze, which for some reason is not moving forward. Yeah. But that was the main thing. A lot of people are dying to have this real information, but I see very few people that, like you, Geeta, that really trying to bring it together. My suggestion would be that some of you, like Ranjit and you and Geeta, should organize a kind of internal Ayurvedic meeting and bring more colleagues with the same understanding. Right now there is mine and yours, and I think this is, we're talking about one medicine. So I think it will be better to bring your colleagues on the same page, so it's not only the burden on you rather than the whole Ayurveda can move forward. I think there's a lot of things. Chinese you were talking about, yes, we are working with them. Chinese has a pharmacopoeia of, they also said the raw material, the cut and slices and pieces, and how we process. So they have a separate pharmacopoeia of processing.
Yeah.
And so we are working with them to see if you boil what happened, if you fry what happened.
Yes.
So they are getting all the chemistry behind it, what happened when we do all these things. And it can be done. I think the West is trying to get something that they can work on, which makes sense. So finding a collaboration, I don't think it will be a challenge for you, and you already have collaboration. So with that one, I think we had 4 speakers, and I would like to close because we have a break. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions around here.